Alright, we're on to part 2 of the theory of representative realism, which again is a theory of perceptual knowledge that's supposed to have significant advantages over the first theory of perceptual knowledge we looked at, direct realism. So just for review, according to representative realism, again a theory of perceptual knowledge, we indirectly perceive external, mind-independent physical objects in virtue of directly perceiving our sensory ideas, which are mental objects, mental thingies. Okay? But how are we to know, for example, that the railroad tracks are really parallel instead of converging when all we directly perceive are mental objects? And that's a typo. Where it says straight, it should say converging. I guess I should edit that, but I'm not. Alright, so further, how can we know anything at all about physical objects? And this is the questions that we're going to address in this portion of the lecture. So let's presume first that our sensory ideas are evidence that there is an external world and that it is roughly the way it appears to be. So this is not unfamiliar. Think about your reflection in the mirror. If you see your reflection in the mirror, that's evidence about the nature of you. So for example, if you want to know if you have cut yourself shaving and you look in the mirror and you see a blood looking thing in the reflection in the mirror, that's evidence that your face has been cut from your razor. Baby Bob's image on a screen is also evidence that, say, a chair is in front of him. Can't Baby Bob know there's a chair in front of him, even if he only sees it on a screen? Well, sure. But the question is why? Why would the answer be yes? And so to continue developing our theory, we're going to have to look at some further notions, some further insights. And this leads to two important theses of representative realism. First, in the example of Baby Bob again, Bob can only perceive the chair if the camera is working correctly. There must be the right causal connection. Second, even if the camera is working properly, the image on the screen must resemble the chair in the appropriate way. The image on the screen must, in a sense, look like the chair. So let's say that, let's take a look at the causation thesis then, a little bit more closely. Let's say that our sensory ideas can give us access to the external world if they are caused in the right kind of way. The causation thesis then can be expressed thus. Accurate perception requires an appropriate causal connection between the sensory ideas and the objects indirectly perceived, the objects of those ideas. So Baby Bob can be said to perceive the chair that he sees indirectly in virtue of seeing directly the image on the screen because the image on the screen is caused by the physical chair. Okay? So, here's another example. Take the example of a plane on a radar screen. Air traffic controllers look at this all day long. While the dot doesn't look like a plane, it represents the location of the plane because it's caused, in some sense, by the actual plane. The radar, rotates, it sends out a signal, the signal hits the plane and then gets reflected back, and so by being reflected off the plane, it causes, so that reflection, that event of the signal being reflected off the plane causes that little dot on the radar screen to be where it is. So we can say that the air traffic controllers know where the plane is, even though they're not directly perceiving the plane. So of course if the radar is defective, so that birds and clouds and stuff can cause these dots, and we'd say that the dots aren't going to be caused in the right sort of way, but a properly functioning radar will accurately and only portray airplanes. Well, let's talk about resemblance then. Sensory ideas should also resemble the physical objects. Once again, let's return to Baby Bob. The image on his screen looks like a chair. It resembles the physical objects. So this leads to the resemblance thesis. If our sensory ideas are caused in the appropriate way, they will represent or resemble the objects we indirectly perceive. So if the chair causes the image on the screen the right way, then Bob will indirectly perceive the chair. When the airplane, there's a sense in which these dots resemble the plane. They don't resemble the plane in all of its details, because they're certain, but they represent and resemble the location of the plane. More sophisticated radar could probably do more. Okay, well, here's an example of resemblance. You're all familiar with this notion. Here's a painting of President Obama, and then pretend this is actually Obama, not just a picture of him, a JPEG. But this painting resembles Obama. Okay? So these two theses are crucial for the representative realist. So let's present them together. Again, the causation thesis. Accurate perception requires an appropriate causal connection between the sensory ideas and the objects indirectly perceived, the objects of those ideas, and the resemblance thesis. If our sensory ideas are caused in the appropriate way, they will represent or resemble the objects we indirectly perceive. We're going to be it's worth reviewing. All right, well, this leads then to the theory of perception that we've been discussing, representative realism, and it's got two components. It shares something in common with direct realism. That's the realist component. It holds that there are mind-independent external physical objects, and those are objects of our perception. And remember, something's mind-independent when it exists, and it has the properties it has. It is the way it is, independently of any perceiver. Well, both direct realism and representative realism are realist theories, and they think there are mind-independent external physical objects, and those are objects of our perception. The distinguishing feature, though, is that it's representative, because we indirectly perceive physical objects in virtue of directly perceiving sensory ideas. But these sensory ideas are caused by the physical objects, and they resemble the physical objects as well. Alright, well, that's the theory, but now let's see how it succeeds. And the theory is only going to be as good as the problem cases it handles. So let's see how it compares to direct realism when it comes to the problem cases. And recall, there was hallucinations, there was time gaps, there was illusions, there was the problem of perceptual relativity. Well, let's see it. We'll start with illusions. And you've all done this before. Take a pencil and a cup of water and stick the pencil in the cup of water. Well, the pencil is actually straight, but when it's in the water, it will appear bent. This is a problem for the direct realists because the direct realists say that the object of perception just is numerically identical to the physical object, but since the object of perception has different properties than the physical object, by Leibniz's law, it cannot be numerically identical. Well, representative realists have a pretty good answer to this. We're calling the causation and resemblance thesis. If a sensory idea is not caused in the right sort of way, then there will be problems with resemblance. Well, in the case of the stick in the water, the sensory idea of the stick in the water won't be caused in the normal right sort of way, for example, when it's in the air. So in the case of the stick in the water, the light that is refracted from the bottom part of the stick is bent. That is, the light's bent, and so when passing from one medium, water, to another, air. But this would be unlike a normal causal situation in which the stick or the pencil is just in air. There's no water as a medium. In which case, our sensory ideas there resemble appropriately the stick. The sensory idea is straight and the stick is straight. Okay? Take the example of your dad on vacation. Here's a picture of Dad pretending like he's holding an elephant in his hand. Well, the elephant's, in fact, a really large creature, but in this image, it appears as if the elephant can fit on top of Dad's hand. Well, think about the causation and resemblance thesis again. In this case, the sensory idea doesn't resemble the elephant. It doesn't resemble the elephant's size, and this has to do with, again, with various stuff like the distance between the elephant and Dad and the way the camera's set up. So, alright, well, let's look at illusions now, which can be caused by various things, chemical disorders or whatever. Well, in the case of illusions, as well as in the case of hallucinations, there's a broken causal chain between the perceiver and the physical environment the perceiver is in. So so what happens is, in the representative realists will say that in cases of illusions, the sensory ideas aren't caused in the right sort of way. In the case of perceptual relativity, that's a little bit more tricky. Because appealing to the causation and resemblance theses will not be enough. But fortunately, the representative realist has a solution. Here's an example that the philosopher John Locke used. And I'm not talking about the character from Lost. I'm talking about the person who wrote true treatises of civil government that influenced actually the America's Constitution and Founding Fathers. But he wasn't just a political philosopher. He had a theory of perception as well. So take 3 buckets of water. We'll take one that's cold, one that's hot, and one that's lukewarm. Well, stick your left hand in the cold bucket and stick your right hand in the hot bucket. Hold it for a minute, then take out your hands and stick both hands in the lukewarm bucket. What happens? The same bucket of water will feel hot to your left hand and cold to your right hand at the very same time. If you don't believe me, try it. How are we to explain this? Well, is there any reason to suppose that one sensation accurately resembles the temperature of the water while another sensation does not? It's like your left hand's accurate, your right hand's not. That just seems arbitrary, though. there's no principled way to distinguish between what would be the accurate sensation and what would not. Well, Locke dealt with this by distinguishing sensory ideas that depend upon and resemble the intrinsic properties of the physical object from sensory ideas that do not. That is, he drew a distinction between what he called primary qualities and secondary qualities. Primary qualities of physical objects and secondary qualities of physical objects. And current science supports this. So, current science, many of you might be science majors, holds that ordinary objects that we see, like tables and chairs, human bodies and flutes, pickles, have a microstructure that consists in atoms and molecules that we don't perceive without perhaps using really advanced instruments like microscopes and electron microscopes. John Locke knew about this. We have more theory. We have much more evidence for it now, much more confirmation of it. But he was on to something, and he agreed and took it a step further. He said that many of the qualities of physical objects depend on the microstructure of it. So the size, shape, texture, and mass and motion of an object depends on these like microstructures, like the molecules and atoms, and how they're related to each other and how they're arranged. Well, the microstructural properties are what Locke would call primary qualities. Okay. Take the example of water. The microstructure of water is one oxygen, and well, it's H2O, so it's a combination of hydrogen and oxygen, arranged in the appropriate array. And but then it leads. I got some emails. It leads to this macrostructure. So a water molecule consists of 3 atoms. But when we see water and we drink it and we swim in it, we splash it on each other and it rains on us, it's got all sorts of macrostructures. It can, depending on what state it's in, solid or liquid or gas. And then even when it's like supposedly liquid, it can be wavy and choppy, or it can be smooth, it can be rippled. That would be the macrostructure of water. But the macrostructure of water depends on the microstructure. What the surface of water is doing is dependent on what all those individual molecules are doing and how they're related to each other. Well, let's say then that our primary quality ideas are sensory ideas that are caused by the primary qualities of a physical object, but we'll also say that they resemble the physical object. Well, the representative realist holds then that the size, shape, texture, mass, and motion of physical objects are primary qualities that cause our primary quality ideas, which are one sensory idea, type of sensory idea we have, and they are also they are resembled by our primary quality ideas. That is, our primary quality ideas are caused by and resemble primary qualities of physical objects. And these would be the qualities that physics studies. Well, qualities like shape, size, and mass don't seem to be the qualities that give us trouble in cases of perceptual relativity. If Steve says the shape is circular and Sam says the shape is square, they both can't be right, because the shape is going to be determined by the object's microstructure. However, for the representative realist, it will turn out that in cases of candy tasting sweet to Steve and salty to Sam, both Steve and Sam are right. And you're going to say, hold on there, isn't that a contradiction? And didn't you rail against contradictions? Yes, I did rail against contradictions, and yes, I hate contradictions. But the good news for the representative realist is that Steve and Sam don't contradict each other. That's because properties like sweet, bitter, warm and cold, and green and so on are not in the actual physical object itself. Instead, they're partially dependent on the perceiver. So unlike primary qualities, secondary qualities such as red, sweet, warm, salty, green, cold, and so on are not properties in the object. Instead, if we say some physical object is red, what we mean as representative realists is that the physical object has the power to cause a red sensation in normal perceivers such as us and under normal conditions. So then the object is not really red, but instead the object has the causal powers to produce or cause a red sensation in us. Okay? So just because it causes a red sensation in us doesn't mean that it's actually red, right? That's what the representative realist will say. Again, a physical object can cause a red or a warm sensation, sensory idea in us without it being actually red or warm. It just has the power to produce it. So in the case of secondary qualities are caused by physical objects, mainly the primary qualities of physical objects, but secondary qualities do not resemble the physical objects. So when Steve says the candy is sweet, Steve is reporting Steve's sensation of the candy, not an actual property of the candy. In a very important sense, however, the secondary qualities of an object depend on its primary qualities. Whether the candy is sweet or not does in part depend on the candy's molecular structure. And chemists, nutritionists, all sorts of people could explain that to you. This is, again, continuous with modern scientific findings. But the sensation of sweetness is also dependent on how you are constituted. For example, the primary qualities that cause donuts to taste sweet to me may cause them to taste bitter to you. Again, this is confirmed by contemporary science. People have different arrangements of taste buds in their tongue. Some people have a sweet tooth. That just means they have more taste buds for receiving sweet sensations. Some people, for example, take wine connoisseurs. Some people like a sweet wine. Some people like a dry wine. And it has to do with their taste bud arrangement. So how things taste to them is dependent on how they are constituted. So this is, again, science. Well, let's compare primary and secondary qualities then some. First, primary qualities are mind independent. Secondary qualities are mind dependent. A very important distinction. This will probably show up on a quiz. If at least one of us would be wrong if I said the table was square and you said the table was circular, because physical objects have the shape they have independent of the perceiver. But neither of us would be wrong if I said the candy was sweet and you said it was bitter. For taste is a secondary quality. Therefore, the object isn't sweet or bitter in itself, independently of a perceiver. It's partially dependent on the power to produce sensation of us, but also partially dependent on how you are constituted. Second, our primary quality ideas, if caused in the appropriate way, will resemble the primary qualities that produce them. So, our secondary quality ideas, on the other hand, do not resemble anything in the object. According to Locke, there is nothing like our secondary quality ideas existing in bodies. Ooh, got an email. So, this is how the representative realist handles the problem of perceptual relativity. The properties that are relative to perceivers are secondary qualities. They are mind-dependent and not in the object at all. So it's not a problem in that an object is sweet or red to one person or bitter or green to another. We can all be aware of different sensations even if they are produced by the same object. Representative realism further has the merits of being able to explain the problem cases that prove difficult, if not impossible, well really impossible to solve for the direct realist. Again, the causation and resemblance thesis explain how in illusions and hallucinations, one is aware of sensory ideas that fail to resemble or represent external physical objects accurately. And it's because of a glitch in the causal chain somewhere. The distinction between primary and secondary qualities gives the representative realist the resources to account for perceptual relativity. However, we also want our theory of perception, representative realism, to explain how perception can be a source of knowledge. For when we are directly aware of something, as a direct realist says we are of external physical objects, we come to possess beliefs about the object in a way that requires no inference. This leads to a difficulty with representative realism. We are only indirectly aware of physical objects. I may know or be justified in believing that a book appears rectangular, but how can I know or be justified in believing that the book is rectangular? It's like there's this veil between us and the world. Our sensory ideas are the veil, or the curtain, and to get to the external world, we have to kind of somehow pull the veil, but we can't do that. Oh no, does this lead back to skepticism? Don't worry. The representative realist beliefs that there are physical objects and that they are in certain ways, they are a conclusion that's inferred from that in which he does have direct access to sensory ideas. So, in a sense, the representative realist does have to infer the existence of the physical world from the sensory ideas that we directly perceive. That's not a problem, though. The inference, it's not a problem, but I should note, though, the inference can't take the form of a logical deduction, because there's no logical guarantee. There is no logical guarantee that the objects in the world are as they appear to be. Again, this is because of hallucinations and illusions, but there's good inductive reasons to believe it. So, how would they go about reasoning this way? Let me explain. The representative realist reasons inductively. His sensory ideas are evidence that there are external physical objects. The inference from I perceive a cuppish idea to there is a cup it's reasonable. That is, there's existence of a cup seems to be the best explanation for why I have this cup-shaped sensory idea. And this is what philosophers call an inference to the best explanation. It happens in philosophy as well as in many other sciences. So here's the data. We have certain facts that we have direct access to about the nature of our perceptual experiences. Our experiences are not the product of our own imagination. We receive them, they're given, but they're also clear and vivid, orderly, uniform, and coherent. Unlike, say, hallucinations or dreams. Further, our experience of these sensory objects is involuntary. They're not under our control. This is the data to be explained. Well, here's the argument then. Our sensory ideas are produced by either our imagination, dreaming, or the external mind-independent objects in the physical world. Premise 2, it is not the case that our sensory ideas are produced by our imagination. Premise 3, it's not the case that our sensory ideas are produced by sole dreaming. Conclusion, so our sensory ideas are produced by mind-independent external objects in the physical world. So the key is, what support could we find for premises 2 and 3? Well, let's look at premise 2 first. Premise 2 says it is not the case that our sensory ideas are produced by our imagination. Well, our sensory ideas are involuntary. We can't control them the way we can control what we imagine, all right? I mean, it's just kind of forced upon us, all right? Like the example of my annoying neighbors lighting fireworks after 11 o'clock at night. Whether I like it or not, I have to listen to it if I continue to live in my neighborhood. Those ideas, those sounds are forced upon me. Well, let's look at premise 3 then. Maybe we're dreaming. Well, our sensory experiences are clear, vivid, orderly, and uniform, and coherent. Dreams, on the other hand, are not. My dreams are crazy. They're rarely uniform. They're not orderly. There's no continuity between one night to the next. It's not like I have this dream world that I occupy for 8 hours every 24 hours, where I return to the exact same place and the exact same people. No, it changes literally from REM cycle to REM cycle, and they make no sense half the time. So there's a huge difference between dreaming and then what we experience in our waking life. Well, that just leads to the conclusion then. I note, though, that the support for premises 2 and 3 is inductive, not deductive. It's a very high probability that those premises are true. All right. So I said then, the support for premises 2 and 3, in which case is the support for the conclusion 4, is ultimately inductive, not deductive. But since the representative realist hypothesis is still better than the alternative hypotheses, and it's in fact explains why our experiences are so uniform, clear, forceful, and coherent, because our sensory ideas are, again, caused by and resemble the physical object, it's reasonable that it's the correct theory. So then we're generally justified in our perceptual beliefs. If you believe there's a cat in front of you because you have a sensory idea of a cat, you're justified in believing that. You could say you know it. Well, then this leads to the 3 questions that any theory of perceptual knowledge must answer. Well, let's look at how the representative realist answers those 3 questions, and let's review those questions real quick. Question 1. How should we characterize the objects we typically say we perceive? Question 2. What sort of access do we have to these objects? And question 3. In virtue of what can we justifiably say we know about these objects? How does perception yield knowledge? Let's look at question 1 first. How, again, should we characterize the objects that we say we perceive? Well, the representative realist agrees with the direct realist. Tables and chairs are mind-independent physical objects. So those are the objects that we perceive. Question 2, what sort of access do we have to those objects? Well, this is where they part ways with the direct realist. We have indirect access to the external mind, independent physical objects, because we have direct awareness of sensory ideas, which are caused by and resemble those objects. Question 3, in virtue of what can we justifiably say we know about these objects? How does perception yield knowledge? And again, it's that argument I just looked at, which involves an inference to the best explanation. The hypothesis that our sensory ideas are caused by and to some extent resemble certain qualities of external mind-independent objects is the best explanation for why we have the experiences we do, and why they are so forceful, clear, orderly, and coherent. So then we're justified in thinking that there are physical objects, and they generally are the way they appear to be. And the causation and resemblance thesis captures the reliable nature of the perceiver's relation to the external objects, and it is the truth that justifies us in taking perception to be a source of knowledge. The end.